It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. We'll talk now about the Venezuela situation in the context of the large number of Venezuelans in the New York area. For many years now, Venezuela has been at the center of one of the largest displacement crises in the world. Millions of people have left the country amid economic collapse, shortages of basic necessities, in part due to U.S. sanctions, and political repression. Here in New York, we are home to a large and politically engaged Venezuelan community. The U.S. military operation in Venezuela that removed Nicholas Maduro from power raises the question, what does all this mean for Venezuelans here and who still have family back home? Ironically, last year when Maduro was still in charge, the Trump administration, wanting recent asylum seekers to leave, said it had already become safe enough to return to Venezuela, and he revoked their temporary protected immigration status. Now the administration is saying it again for the new context: no Maduro, no problem. Here is Department of Homeland Security Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs Tricia McLaughlin on Fox News.
The great news for those who are here from Venezuela on temporary protected status is that they can now go home with hope for their country, a country that they love, that there's going to be peace, prosperity, and stability.
Well, how much is that true? Let's talk. Joining us is Gisela Salim-Peyer, Associate Editor at The Atlantic and a native of Venezuela, who's been reporting closely and deeply on the situation in that country, including the opposition movement and the country's relationship with the United States. Gisela, thank you so much for some time today. Welcome to WNYC.
Thank you so much for having me.
And listeners, we want to invite you in, especially if you're part of New York's Venezuelan community or if you have family still in Venezuela. How are you reacting to this moment? Does the U.S. role feel like help, interference, some of each, something I didn't mention? And what are you worried or relieved about right now? 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692. Would you start, Gisela, by just describing in general terms the size and makeup of the New York Venezuelan community? Who's here and why?
I don't think there is a very big Venezuelan community, or at least not as big as in other parts of the U.S., like, Miami and, the South Florida areas or the Austin. But New York being such a big city, there's a lot of Venezuelans, and they're here for different reasons. They arrived at different times. Some of them are, they've been here for years and are professionals. Others are more recently arrived with the waves that came during the second Trump administration and the Biden administration. People that maybe crossed the border by foot, trekked through the Darien. So there's all sorts of Venezuelans in New York.
Did earlier generations of Venezuelans who might be more professional in their work backgrounds or their class, in class terms, are there differences and reasons why they came in that generation to the large number of asylum seekers? People will remember during the Biden administration, especially when there was such a flood of asylum seekers across the border from various places in Latin America. Venezuela, for a while, was producing the most, and so many were coming to New York. So when you look generationally, was there a difference in motivation for arriving here?
I think this holds true for Venezuela as for many other countries. I think the people who left sooner, the sooner you left, the higher your, let's say, economic means. So, and the more comfortable the conditions in which you left. So, the people who started living, let's say, late aughts or early 2010s were definitely, they were living in a better condition. They were living maybe to study here. They came by plane. Then, as the situation got worse and worse, you had more people overstaying their visas. And then you had, people going to the U.S. by foot and trekking the Darien because the humanitarian crisis was so dire that they couldn't make ends meet.
You were in the courtroom, I see, when Maduro was arraigned. Describe the scene in terms of Venezuelan New Yorkers who came out to witness it.
Yes, so Venezuelan New Yorkers were the biggest group of people who had come to hoping to get a seat at the court. None of them came because they out of solidarity for Maduro. They came to see a tyrant punished, or at least were the terms in which this was described to me. A lot of them, not a lot of them. Let's say a couple of them had been political prisoners. There was, this woman Laura who lives in Madrid, and she came to New York to help her daughter with her newborn. And she told her daughter, and she told her daughter that the 5-month-old was gonna be left with a nanny because she just couldn't miss this moment. Then there was another political activist from the opposition called David Cárdenas, and he was very active in the opposition. So Maduro one time had singled him out on TV, and said that Operation Knock Knock was going to come for him. Operation Knock Knock is when, the police comes, knocks your door and takes you to jail. And David responded to that to Trump's on Instagram by saying that Operation Trump was going to come for Maduro. So in the waiting outside the courthouse, he told me kind of with a smug smile, I guess, Trump came before knock knock.
I understand. But so those Venezuelans who showed up at the courtroom who were anxious to see Maduro punished, how much do you think they represent the larger group of Venezuelans in New York as opposed to a smaller activist core?
I wouldn't be able to tell you that. I think it's definitely like to be able to, take some time off work and show up. You definitely have to be have to have means, like, let's say, I know a lot of Venezuelans here in New York are, undocumented or have sort of more fragile legal status. The people I spoke to in the courtroom, like to the extent that they were willing to share their status, they had green cards. They were not, they were neither undocumented nor on asylum. Or actually, one was on asylum, but he had already been given asylum.
Well, explain even further how, to the extent to which you think it's true, that some people see Maduro's ouster as long overdue accountability, and others see it as a dangerous precedent. Like in your story, you wrote about scenes from the courtroom that included a conversation with a woman you call Maria. You wrote, Maria told me that no one she knew in America could understand why she was excited to see Maduro arrested. She said, my friends are like, this is imperialism, and so sorry Trump did this to your country. But that's, I guess, surprising to Maria. So explain that tension.
I don't know that it was surprising to Maria. Maria thinks of her, like Maria told me that she really empathizes with progressive politics and progressive causes. She was frustrated that Venezuela is such a left-right issue that, people, she expressed some frustration when she spoke to me that people on the left were just like sort of less willing to see Venezuela as like a very dire humanitarian crisis. And, she said that her housemate was a prison abolition activist, and she empathizes with that, some of the things that her housemate advocates for. But when her housemate, an abolition activist, wanted to protest the mistreatment of Maduro, she said, basically, like, my empathy has limits.
Yeah, I understand. Did you witness, when you were covering the arraignment, dueling protests? Because just as in the tension that was the premise of the last question, there were people there, obviously Venezuelans who were happy to see Maduro removed from power and maybe brought to justice as they see it. We have a text from somebody who writes, Venezuelan New Yorkers who came to support the arraignment clashed with leftist protesters who, and one side called the other side names, according to this text. But did you see anything like that?
I saw a little bit of that before getting into the courthouse. There were the Hands of Venezuela people on one side, and there were the other people, which were mostly Venezuelan, who were there in a celebratory mood. And yeah, I think. And also in the court, I said that in the courthouse, waiting to see the trial, most of the people, were Venezuelans eager to see Maduro punished, but not all. Some of them were, let's say, law students who spoke with a bit more, who were less sanguine about this. They were saying, like, you have to separate the issue of the capture with the issue of this trial, but the capture puts the system of international justice in danger. And I think one way to summarize, like, this sort of clash in perspectives is that I think for American and international observers, this is all about something bigger than Venezuela. This is about the fact that a U.S. president can bomb a country and overthrow a foreign leader without so much as a war declaration or congressional approval.
Right.
But
so, go ahead. No, go ahead. Finish your thought.
But for Venezuelans, I think this is mostly about Venezuela. And yeah.
So if most of those at the courthouse supporting the removal were Venezuelan, can you say anything about the demographics of the people who were there opposing it?
Opposing the
opposing the U.S. action.
I mean, I don't think you mean outside the court.
Who were the protesters against doing what Trump did?
I didn't do much reporting on that. I think they seemed American. They had the Hands of Venezuela signs, which, but I cannot. That was not. I did most of my reporting waiting for the arraignment and in the courthouse. Like, everything I did was in the courthouse. It was just a fleeting sight that I saw. These dueling crowds.
Got it. I played the clip introducing the segment of a Trump administration official saying it's now safe to go home. And I mentioned that even last year, well before they removed Maduro last week, the Trump administration was saying things have improved in Venezuela. All you Venezuelan migrants who came in the last few years, it's safe to go home now. Obviously, the Trump administration is trying to get so many Latin American migrants and even other migrants to leave the country. And now they're saying it again with the removal of Maduro. Can you reflect on any of the reality of that, either last year, whether things were actually becoming safe enough again in Venezuela for any reason that it was appropriate to remove en masse the temporary protected status that had been offered to Venezuelans because of Maduro's rule, or if the removal of Maduro changes the safety or livability for Venezuelans here who might want to go back there?
I think this is not true. It was neither true last year and it's not true now. So it was not true last year because after the July 28th, 2024 election, where Maduro basically lost the election, but proclaimed himself victor and stayed in power, there was a very acute wave of repression, where a lot of activists, opposition staffers, and also just regular people who had maybe shared an anti-Maduro meme on social media were thrown into prison. So it was definitely not true last year because that wave of repression was still going strong, and it's definitely not true now because it doesn't look, I mean, Maduro is for sure out of the picture in Venezuela, but regime change does not appear to be guaranteed. And in fact, ever since Saturday, it seems like the regime has held together. Delcy Rodriguez got sworn in, and in the right after the event where she got sworn in, the inauguration ceremony, 10 journalists were arrested and sent to political prisoners. Diosdado Cabello and Vladimir Padrino Lopez, two of the ministers, said that they would do a big investigation as to the Venezuelans who have supported the U.S. military interventions, suggesting that they would be sent to Venezuela's, notorious jails and torture chambers. So
let's take a phone call. Ken in Florida says he's a Venezuelan American. Ken, you're on WNYC. Thank you so much for calling in.
Yes, hi there. First time calling in. I wanted to say that, as somebody who's grew up in both countries, I understand why a lot of Venezuelans are happy about what happened. Certainly nobody defends Maduro, but I don't support the way that this was done. I don't agree that the end justifies the means. And I really am upset about what that means for the United States as, the aggressor, really. But at the same time, nobody could have removed this or fixed the government in Venezuela from within. So there needed to be some external action that has been overdue for the last 25 years, to be honest. And I think that's where a lot of the jubilation and a lot of the looking the other way from the Venezuelan community comes from.
Yeah, so it sounds like you would have rather seen maybe some kind of regional action led by a coalition of Latin American countries, maybe with the United States involved, but not this sort of U.S. removing Maduro for the interests of the United States. Am I paraphrasing you well?
I think that's correct. Although the international coalitions and that sort of thing, that's been ongoing since Chavez was there. So I think there's been a lot of frustration because it has felt from Venezuelans that nobody has really paid attention or helped in any meaningful way other than simply looking over elections and just allowing fraud and fraudulent elections to continue.
Have you had conversations with other Venezuelan Americans who you may know in Florida about what you laid out here, your sort of mixed feelings about being happy that Maduro is out but not liking the way it was done?
I think for the most part, yes, I have. And I think for the most part, Venezuelans are just happy that this, the head of this very terrible government is out. And I don't think, from the people that I've spoken with and the comments that I've read online, I don't think anybody's really looking beyond that. And that's what concerns me, is that I don't see anything changing.
Yeah. So let me read you a text and from another listener and just get your take, and then I'll ask our guest. Listener writes, Maduro needed to be removed, no questions about it, but the biggest threat to Venezuelans will be the American intervention and the illegal taking of their natural resources. History, facts, writes this person, the U.S. foreign policy has never been in favor of the countries they target. My country, Guatemala, writes this person, suffered the U.S. Monroe Doctrine as much as many other countries, so good luck, Venezuela. Say goodbye to your sovereignty. What are you thinking or feeling as you hear that text?
That's how I feel as well. I think it's horrible, among other things, that the United States, and President Trump intends to simply exploit the natural resources of another country and intends to administer them to their, as they see fit.
Ken, I really appreciate
stealing the sovereignty of our country.
Thank you very much. Feel free to call us again. Any thoughts from you, Gisela, as you listen to that call and that text?
I think the apprehension, I think there's a lot of people who are very apprehensive. I think there's, it's interesting because I spoke with an international human rights lawyer who said that she has been documenting instances of Maduro's abuses and tortures and extrajudicial killings for years. And I asked her, I thought that she was going to have some reservations about the way that these strikes were carried. And she said not at all, because she said that, like, if international law was going to do something, it would have already done it by now. But I think there is a lot of apprehension, especially inside the country. And it's a tricky situation because the people inside the country cannot really speak right now because there's a lot of repression. They cannot speak candidly. But the people outside the country, who are activists and, the most vocal people outside the country are very enthusiastic about this. But I think there is a feeling that we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if the country that will emerge from all of this will be better.
I'm looking at the headline of the article you published in The Atlantic yesterday called "The Venezuelan Opposition's Desperate Gamble." Who do you mean by the opposition, and what is this desperate gamble?
The opposition, Venezuela has the particularity that although it has been in a dictatorship for a lot of time, it has a very organized opposition movement. So the opposition movement has had many leaders, but these leaders have always backed each other. There's no, like it's a unified movement. So right now, the leader of the opposition movement is Maria Corina Machado. But I think it's fair to say that she's the leader of the movement, not just of like a faction within the movement, because everybody has just sort of been behind her. I think the opposition is, the Venezuelan opposition movement is remarkably unified.
Unified behind Machado? President Trump said she doesn't have the respect or support to run the country. Do you think there's any grain of truth to that?
Polls do not back up what Trump said. She is the most she's the most popular politician in Venezuela by far. According to polls, in 2023, before the election primary, she won more than 90% of the votes in the opposition primary, and she would have run for president had she not been banned, precisely because Maduro and company thought that she was too dangerous. So no, I think some sources that from the Venezuelan opposition that have tried to make sense of Trump's comments have suggested to me that what Trump means with not having respect within the country is that she doesn't have respect within the military, which is needed to, keep order in the country. That's what they think, but I'm not sure if that's what Trump actually meant.
Why do you think that Trump really sidelined her then? We played the clip on Monday's show of Maria Corina Machado at the Nobel Peace Prize, or near the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony. She won the Nobel Peace Prize for 2025, and she was there in Oslo, and she dedicated the prize to President Trump because of his pressure on Maduro. And even with all this popularity as the leading opposition leader, as you were just describing, when Trump removed Maduro, he kicked her to the curb at the same time. Why do you think Trump did that?
Can you repeat the question? What do you think she did exactly?
Why do you think Trump sidelined Machado?
That is a very, very good question, and I don't know that I have the answer to. There is a lot of, depending on who you ask, that you will get a different response. People who are more cynical would say that, Trump is so bitter about not winning the Nobel Prize that could be a very big reason. Then there's some New York Times reporting that suggests that the presidential envoy Brian Lerner just got frustrated with her because she didn't really have a plan to lead the country, and she was sort of overestimating how fragile the Maduro regime was, and they just didn't trust her. And I think some of the most hopeful Venezuelans, they think that this is part of a grand strategy to get for a regime change, but they say, not yet. I mean, Machado is not ready for this. That's what the Venezuelans who have a more generous interpretation of what Trump is saying think.
Yeah. And in fact, we have this text with a question kind of to this point that asks, if the entire regime is left in place, judicial, governmental, police, military, because that seems to be the case. Maduro's own vice president is the one who Trump has endorsed as being in charge now. Will the security and welfare of Venezuelan citizens improve? Asks this listener. So with Trump sort of in charge, but Maduro's vice president also in charge, what do you think does change domestically for Venezuelans?
That really remains to be seen. I think so far it has been remarkable how the regime has held together, how much military leaders and high-up ministers have made a point of doing a lot of press conferences, being seen. As I mentioned before, that they arrested these 10 journalists after Delcy Rodriguez's inauguration. That seems to be sort of making a point, like we are still here. We are not. I mean, very little has changed. And Delcy Rodriguez herself said that there was only one president of Venezuela, and that this person's name was Nicholas Maduro. So there seems to be they seem to be holding on to the status quo or making a big effort to give the appearance that that's what's happening. A very important fact is that the political prisoners are still in prison. And, I think there is an agreement among the activists that I have spoken to that if there is going to be change, a sort of wider regime change that goes beyond ousting Maduro, the first step will be freeing the political prisoners, and that there's no sign that that's going to happen, even though Trump suggested that that Helicoide had been closed, but that has not happened yet.
I'm looking at the list of articles that you've written for The Atlantic in recent months, and I see that as early as October, you wrote one with the headline, "The U.S. is preparing for war in Venezuela." So you saw this coming. You wrote another one in November called "Why Maduro Probably Can't Count on Putin." And then another one in November that's relevant to something Trump and Marco Rubio and others have been saying just in the last few days since they seized Maduro, that other countries should watch out, like Colombia. And you had an article in November called "Why is Colombia's President Provoking Trump?" Gustavo Petro seems to think that he's better off being the American president's victim than his friend. So I'll bite. Why is Colombia's President Petro provoking Trump? And when you say victim, is he sort of preparing himself to be ousted too?
Well, I think that could be a bit far-fetched. I think Petro had a lot of Latin American leaders went ahead and criticized Trump's actions in the Caribbean, which is, I think, an understandable position if you're a Latin American leader and you see Trump attacking a Latin American country. You see Claudia Sheinbaum has condemned this. I think Lula has condemned...
President of Mexico, Sheinbaum, yes.
Yes, exactly. And Lula of Brazil condemned it. But I think Petro went really a bit farther than most. He was, more bombastic in his delivery. He went, outside of the United Nations and said... and told the American military to ignore Trump. And then he... in an interview, he sort of suggested that Trump should be ousted, which left the interviewer visibly shocked that, as a Colombian president was proposing regime change in the United States. So he definitely made a point of being, of going farther than just condemnation. And I think, as I wrote in that article, and after interviewing, many Colombian observers, I think it has to do more with his internal politics. There's going to be elections in Colombia next year, and I think he hopes that his protege will win, and his party will favor. And I think, it's something like he sort of hopes that the population will rally around him. I think in Colombia the issue of drugs creates a lot of painful memories, and Trump basically said that Gustavo Petro was a drug lord, which is something that even the people in the opposition in Colombia even the people who are critical of Petro would resent, because basically you're saying that the president of Colombia is a drug leader when Colombia has been fighting so hard to get rid of this horrible image it has as like the birthplace of Pablo Escobar and a giant cocaine farm. It was a really painful thing for Colombians to hear, and I think Petro seized on that.
Oh, because a lot of the people in this country who I've heard be critical of the removal of Maduro say the drug charges against him are trumped up. If you really want to look at where drugs are coming into the U.S. from Latin America, it's not fentanyl from Venezuela, that's a fiction. It's cocaine from Colombia. Are you saying that's false?
No, that's not wrong. That's not wrong. But to say that the president of Colombia is a drug lord, there's no evidence for that. It's true that Colombia has a lot of drug production and drug trafficking, but it's not true that the government is complicit. It's not. There's no evidence that Gustavo Petro himself is complicit.
Gisela Salim-Peyer, associate editor at The Atlantic, and a native of Venezuela, who has been reporting closely on Venezuela, the opposition movement, the country's relationship with the United States, and now the Venezuelan community in New York's response to Maduro being brought here for trial. Thank you so much for all your reporting and all your context and all your time with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Since WNYC's first broadcast in 1924, we've been dedicated to creating the kind of content we know the world needs. Since then, New York Public Radio's rigorous journalism has gone on to win a Peabody Award and a DuPont Columbia Award, among others. In addition to this award-winning reporting, your sponsorship also supports inspiring storytelling and extraordinary music that is free and accessible to all. To get in touch and find out more, visit sponsorship.wnyc.org.